about.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another Shadowlands Shaman video guide. My name is Brock Shama, and today we're going to be doing an overall overview, deep dive into the changes for 9.1, covering pretty much everything that's happening to the Shaman class, just revolving around soulbind changes, covenant changes, legendary changes, and any tunings that happened over the course from 9.05 to 9.1. And new items such as trinkets and shards of domination socket items as well. We're going to be going over that. And some just general guide information, tips and tricks as well to help you guys do some really good damage and boost your overalls in Mythic Plus. Before we get started, if you are new to the channel, like the video if you like it, subscribe for more Elemental Shaman content and more just general Shadowlands content into the future, and slap the like button. Comment down below what your thoughts are on the video. It really helps with that whole algorithm thing. And as we leave the comment down below to help out with that algorithm, please also consider supporting my content over on Patreon. This video and others like it would not be possible without that kind of support, so thank you very much for that. So let's get started. When it comes to gearing your Shaman for Mythic Plus, you really want to try and focus your attention on crit and haste gear, and try to avoid gear with any mastery on it. Versatility as a stat is really good for Elemental, as it is a base scaling stat that also doubles as a damage reduction, making it a great stat for really high Mythic Plus keys. So ideally, you want to be above 15 or more % haste, as it gives a more comfortable casting speed, which in all situations is a direct gain to Maelstrom generation. Due to Elemental Shaman having the Elemental Fury passive ability, we gain really high value from our critical strikes. And with 9.05 increasing the damage of our finisher spells, Earth Shock and Earthquake, crit has become even better, as it is one of the few stats that increases their damage directly. So, having a lot of crit is very beneficial. I myself am currently running around 32% crit in the making of this video, and I want more. Gems and enchants should follow the same rules we listed above, but specific enchants for your chest, bracers, and weapons should be plus 30 stats to your chest, plus 15 intellect to your bracers, and celestial guidance to your weapon. Intellect is still our best stat, and if you want to know how to better simulate your character for Mythic Plus, check out my guide on YouTube on how to do so here. It will be in the cards as well as the description of the video. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Echo of the Elements is still our strongest talent on the first row, since a large portion of our damage is still coming from Lava Burst, even with the nerf in 9.05. So run this talent pretty much all the time. You could make a case for Earth and Rage if you are playing the Seeds of Rampant Growth or Skybreaker's Fiery Demise legendaries, as you will have a higher uptime on your Storm Elemental and spam Lightning Bolt situations with enough haste. Aftershock will be our go-to for dungeons, as it yields the biggest AoE damage potential increase, as well as its synergy with Echo of the Great Sundering legendary. The free Maelstrom resets are quite big if you get lucky back-to-back procs, especially with the buff to our spender spells. In 9.05, the massive free Maelstrom generation we get from this talent is even stronger now than it was. The level 30 talent row is up to personal preference. You can run Spirit Wolf for movement speed and damage reduction, or Earth Shield to put on the tank or yourself for some added healing to your group. You can also run Static Charge for more utility in the group. Row 35, the Master of the Elements, is good right now, as it is a flat damage increase on our Earthquakes and Earth Shocks. Also, consuming the buff on your Stormkeeper Lightning Bolts yields a very strong single target damage burst. Storm Elemental is used in the majority of Mythic Plus situations at the moment due to its higher AoE damage throughput, though I recommend you don't use it unless you're within an organized group or you can manage your cooldowns well enough to really bring out the most of its damage. Level 40, your Nature's Guardian is the default choice, since Shamans are historically quite squishy and it adds some additional survivability to your kit. whereas Ancestral Guidance can be very useful if you are confident in your own skill enough to help your healer in burst AoE situations. AG, as it's also said, should be paired with offensive cooldowns to make the most of your healing in its outputs. Level 45 is Primal Elementalist, which gives increased AoE damage with your Fire Elemental or Storm Elemental, new abilities, and an extra defensive cooldown with your Earth Elemental's Hardened Skin abilities. I would recommend using Primal Elementalist in all situations as it is the most versatile talent on the row. We benefit most from extra defensive and value the added damage with our offensive elementals. Level 50 Stormkeeper. Always use this talent in dungeons. In its current form, it's just far too versatile to argue otherwise, as it brings increased AoE, Maelstrom generation, single target or priority damage, and instant cast to give you more mobility. So it's an easy choice, just run it. If you guys are looking to run a standard AoE build with Echoes of Great Sundering as your legendary, Echoes of the Elements, Aftershock, and Storm Elemental will be your preferred choice for that. And then, of course, Primal Elementalist with Stormkeeper, and your other two talents can be whichever which you want to run. If you're looking to run more of a Skybreaker's fire build, consider using Master of the Elements instead if you do not like the Storm Elemental playstyle. Seeds of Rampant Growth obviously works really well with the Storm Elemental build itself, and because you're going to be in Storm Elemental window a lot more, consider running the Earth and Rage talent instead of Echo of the Elements, like I mentioned earlier. There is a great piece of extra info in Mythic Plus, and that is making sure that during your cooldowns you line up the biggest value for them if possible. This means using Stormkeeper or Storm Elemental with on-use trinkets, like the PvP badge that gives you straight intellect, or Soul-Letting Ruby from Theater of Pain, for example. While using the Storm Elemental and Skybreaker's combo, or Seeds of Rampant Growth, you also need to keep in mind the cooldown reduction capabilities of these legendaries. So for Skybreakers, in some cases, it is better to keep Flame Shocks up and spread on as many targets as you can, even while Storm Elemental is out, and you are doing an AoE rotation, depending on if you want the cooldown of Storm Elemental to come back up for the next pack of mobs. For Seeds of Rampant Growth, using Fey Transfusion and Storm Elemental together will ensure the cooldown reduction is always used correctly and the crit buff is up during your cooldown windows. So familiarize yourself with the timings and stretch the limits of the Storm Elemental cooldown. So the moral of the section is that timing is key when using your CDs. The best legendaries are pretty much staying the same in their respective niches, though recrafting your legendaries into new slots will now be recommended to make room for the Sanctum of Domination gear that provides the Shards of Domination sockets. Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence is still the best for pure single target scenarios, or when single target is the main goal. This legendary should now be crafted on your cloak slot. Echoes of the Great Sundering is still one of the strongest legendaries for cleave/AoE, and it has a very potent damage profile for Mythic Plus. This legendary should now be crafted on the glove slot. Skybreaker's Fiery Demise is a good alternative to Echoes in Mythic Plus, but you will need to reliably play around your cooldowns and maintain the Flame Shock's interaction properly to make use of this. This is also a really good option in raids for council-style fights or spread cleave scenarios. This legendary should now be crafted on the ring slot. The Seeds of Rampant Growth legendary is, in my opinion, a better alternative to Skybreakers if you are in the Night Fae Covenant. I have found that this legendary can be really useful and have great payoffs for tyrannical weeks, so tyrannical affixes, in Mythic Plus when paired with Dreamweaver, Soulbind, and while you are properly managing your cooldowns to be up for the boss fights. This legendary should be crafted on the glove slot as well. The Shards of Domination are a new pseudo-set bonus/passive increase for the new raid Sanctum of Domination, though the set bonuses do not work outside of the raid, Torghast, and the Maw. The singular shard passive effects do work and are quite powerful though, so keep that in mind. While in the raid, you will want to use the Unholy Set bonus as it is currently yielding the highest damage increase for Elemental Shamans. Keep an eye out for balancing changes to to the shard bonuses in the future, as this could change though. In Mythic Plus, you will want to use the shard of Diz, Beck, and Core as your main shards to get all the passive damage bonus increases. Additional shards such as Cure for the Absorb Shield and Rev for the Leech are also very useful for your 4th and 5th Domination Shard slot items. All shards can have their power levels increased by buying upgrades from Bonesmith Heimer, I still don't know, located in Korthia, using the Stygian Embers currency acquired from the new raids bosses and mini-bosses. Keep in mind that the set bonus's power level is determined by the lowest shard's item level within the set, so upgrading your raid set evenly is recommended to get the most out of it. The Soulbind changes for Night Bay are overall quite impactful, starting with Naya, Called Shot, and Survivor's Rally add some nice utility boosts to the Soulbind. Looking at it from an either-or standpoint though, Survivor's Rally seems more useful out of the two, especially for PvP, even though mostly PvP players are going to be playing Necrolord. The final row offers Bonded Hearts, which offers some passive healing for your raid party or group, and similar to Ysera's gifts from Druids, so it's kind of like that passive healing. Dreamweaver has had a lot of balancing done to one of its newest lesser traits, Waking Dreams. It used to proc a shield pretty much every time you took damage that brought you below 80% of your health, and for 30% of that damage taken, and it was just an absurd amount of absorb shielding as it had no internal cooldown, and scaled with stats such as versatility, so making it extremely powerful for tanks. But since that tuning has happened quite a while ago, it has since been brought down to a more reasonable activation rate, but it still offers quite a noticeable absorption shield. The same row also offers Cunning Dreams, attaching a utility slow to your Soul Shape ability, but we already know which one of the two is going to be better. But Cunning Dreams does offer quite a good tank kiting kind of strategy if you need an extra slow from your liftoff point when you use Soul Shape for the first time as a Night Fae tank, which some tanks are Night Fae. So Dream Delver is the final row, giving Dreamweaver its much needed damage amp trait. A stacking damage or healing buff offers consistency to the Soulbind where previously it was not present. So this is really, really good for single target fights for DPS, but also hot classes such as Druid or Priest or Shaman. The beautiful Khorane is still a powerhouse in this patch with even more to boast about. So getting Vorkai Ambush and Hunt's Exhilaration as minor traits that both offer strong impacts no matter which you choose, so reducing a target's damage after interrupting them by 5% is very impactful in some circumstances, especially this season in Mythic Plus and the Tormentors that you can interrupt, dealing a lot of group fire damage, so reducing that fire damage by 5% is quite noticeable, and also on some bosses where it does have an interrupt ability, you can reduce the boss's damage they do by 5%, so that's good. But also gaining 3% leech for 5 seconds with no internal cooldown is really good as well, though it does obviously cause you to be within melee combat, or melee range of targets, causing some instances for you to rip aggro off the tank if you're not too careful. So finally, Wild Hunt Stratagem offers a pseudo execute buff for damage dealers and a healing amp to keep your allies topped. Though it could only proc on one target, this still makes Khorane a very strong choice in Mythic Plus for Elemental Shamans, as we can benefit from both the damage and healing portions of this trait with the use of Ancestral Guidance talent. I strongly believe that going forward into 9.1, Night Fae will continue to be a powerhouse covenant for Mythic Plus scene for Shaman in general, especially for Elemental. The new legendary effect for the Covenant is Seeds of Rampant Growth, offering Fey Transfusion a CDR or cooldown reduction effect for the Shaman's main cooldown, and simultaneously giving a large crit bonus. So for Enhancement Shaman, it's Feral Spirits. For Elemental Shaman, that would be Fire Elemental or Storm Elemental, depending if you're talented into that. This legendary is a powerful alternative to the Skybreaker's legendary, because they do very similar things, and in testing does perform well in high tyrannical keys, as I've been playing it myself in those kind of circumstances, and it's yielding quite a big boost to my single target damage while maintaining that overall high AoE throughput that Elemental Shaman need to have in dungeons. As well, you can lower the cooldown of Fate Transfusion to 1.5 minutes using the Essential Extraction Potency Conduit, even lower depending on the rank of that conduit itself. So this may become useful when you are able to play with a Night Fae Priest and being the target of Fae Guardians, lowering the cooldown of your Storm or Fire Elemental by an additional 20 seconds if Fae Guardians is active on your character for the entirety of that duration. So you have the potential to lower your Storm Elemental, if you're talented into it, down to a 1.5 or lower minute cooldown with pairing the Seeds of Rampant Growth Fae Transfusion CDR plus the additional Fae Guardians from Night Priest. This is extremely useful when it comes to CD usage and timings in certain dungeons and key levels. But we also need to note that if you have Fae Guardians active on your character while you are channeling Fae Transfusion using the Seeds of Rampant Growth Legendary, the CDR of Fae Transfusion double dips into Fae Guardians, amplifying the cooldown reduction even further. So you're going to see in some scenarios, your Storm Elemental could have a 40-second cooldown coming out of you channeling Fae Transfusion, but you should note that Storm Elemental and Fae Transfusion, while running this legendary, should always be used together. There are several known issues that the Fae Transfusion cast itself is getting canceled early. Now you may wonder why this is happening or how this is happening, and there's no clear and obvious reason as to why this is happening, but it does happen in a few examples that we know of, namely the Kultharok boss in Theater of Pain, the Spires of Ascension final boss Devos, and the Sanguine Depths final boss General Call. Now, the theory behind these bosses is that you are up on a platform itself, and the Fae Transfusion does not like the interaction of you putting your ground-targeted spell on a platform. One theory that we have is that if you place your character at the position of Kultharok or up on the stairs or bridge of the room, you can circumvent the spell cast from being interrupted, but this is not guaranteed. Another reason why your cast could be getting interrupted is because of the movement speed, anima power that healers do get with the new season. When the buff is applied or fades from your character, it can interrupt the spell cast. Many more things can cause the issue, but do know that you can help Blizzard fix this by just reporting a bug. If you see it happen, just report it. Do your part to help reporting these kind of bugs so that we can get it fixed, as it is very annoying, especially if you are running the Seeds of Rampant Growth Legendary. The Venthyr have been a strong staple for the Enhancement Shaman spec due to the Chain Harvest ability having a great interaction with Maelstrom weapon stacks. This will remain strong in 9.1, but we will likely not see many Elemental Shamans swap to it due to the ability not having much interaction with the spec. Resto Shamans can still make use of the Covenant in Mythic Plus quite often when the Shaman needs to fill that Venthyr role, if other members in the group do not have this Covenant. Nausea has been given some interesting new traits to look at. Sinful Preservation and Nimble Steps kind of scream tank utility, but not many tanks are Venthyr at the moment aside from Guardian Druid. Fatal Flaw, however, gives a powerful stat boost to your character, giving a consistent presence in raids for Enhancement Shaman. Theotar is still all about the Tea Party aesthetics, and the new traits have shown that. It's always tea time, and life is but an appetizer, good names by the way, offer nothing more than positionally required healing and tertiary stats, while Party Favors is quite a unique stat buff on a very long duration, which is good. General Draven is still all about damage mitigation and survivability, so the new traits offer more of it. Regenerative Stone Skin and Intimidation tactics are very different from each other though. It's obvious that you pick one for additional healing and the other is kind of a meme. Battlefield Presence is really strong due to its uptime and consistency, making it very useful for tanks, but not so useful for Elemental or Wrestler Shaman. You could make a case for this to be used for Enhancement Shaman though. The Venthyr Covenant legendary is Elemental Conduit, applying each target healed by Chain Harvest with Riptide and also applying Flame Shark to each target that is damaged by it. This is a pretty great legendary, but more as a support legendary and not as a standalone. I say this because it has really great synergies with other legendaries, such as Skybreaker's Fiery Demise for Elemental, Primal Lava Actuators for Enhancement, and Primal Tidal Core for Restoration. This support style legendary seems to be consistent with the Covenant legendaries though. Kyrian has had a history of being the least impactful Covenant for Shaman all around, though it has gone through some changes this season to bring it more in line with the other Covenants. Pelagos brings Better Together and Path of the Devoted as their new traits give your friends a decent stat buff, or you can choose a nice damage reduction and movement speed utility. Newfound Resolve is a positionally required primary stat increase, though a little annoying to interact with. Its a boost in stats, however, is really potent, but is unpredictable in nature. Clea has offered many utility styles traits in the past and has been given a lot more offensive traits to balance her out. Spear of the Archon and Hope Springs Eternal give you a choice to continue with the additional utility or go more offensively. The final trait, Light the Path, is a continuation effect of Valiant Strikes, offering a critical strike buff to both you and your friendly target healed by Valiant Strikes once its stacks are consumed, along with a stacking crit buff while Valiant Strikes is building up. Mechanicos is a soulbind that offers a whole lot of quality of life traits, but not many offensive or defensive traits when it comes down to it. Until 9.1, that is, where the soulbind starts off with a very potent offensive and defensive traits in Sun Glow, Spectrometer, and Reactive Retrofitting. A Fusion Anima Accelerator offers a boost of damage when placing your Vesper Totem, along with a cooldown reduction based on how many targets are hit by the initial burst of damage. The cooldown reduction is an interesting part of this trait and is going to become very strong later. The legendary for the Kyrian Covenant, Raging Vesper Vortex, gives your Vesper Totem an additional burst of damage and healing when only 3 charges of either damage or healing are consumed. Now, I don't think this is enough to have a DPS increase to surpass the legendaries of either Elemental or Enhancement Shaman, but for Restoration Shamans, this is a really good option. Restoration Shamans generally will fit the Covenant role that is missing in a group, usually a Venthyr in past seasons, in order to gain access to Covenant-specific bonuses in dungeons, but Kyrian, being one of the fewest played Covenants so far, now offers a better damage boost legendary for Restoration Shamans than using Deep Tremor Stone that they have used in the past. Which by design is not a very good legendary, but out of all of the legendaries that Wrestler Shamans could have used, it yielded the biggest damage increase. Having a Restoration Shaman go Kyrian and use the Covenant legendary on top of using Mechanicos as a soulbind can offer a large boost in damage output overall inside the Key or Mythic Plus dungeon for the spec, so it's actually quite strong for them. Necrolords have always been a strong Covenant for both Elemental and Restoration Shamans due to how versatile they are, being a staple when it comes to progression rating and PvP combat. Marileth is known as the PvP soulbind for the Necrolords, and the new traits introduced seem to double down on that idea. Viscous Trail offers some nice self-peel when you are affected by a snare effect, undulating maneuvers helps to reduce your burst damage taken, and that can come in handy against certain team comps or enemies in PvP. And finally, Kevin's Oozling is a versatile trait that is attached to your primordial wave. These additions will be quite strong when brought into arenas, but it is also showing promise in single target combat, specifically talking about Kevin's Oozling. Now, Emily is used well when controlling damage around your Covenant abilities usage with Lead by Example. In 9.1, the new traits Soul Slough and Resilient Stitching were added. The movement speed utility is great for grouped or solo play, and the damage absorbing shield is a nice bonus for survivability. Pustule Eruption is a great damage and healing addition to your Fletchcraft ability. It is not very impressive though by any means when compared to the other Soulbind's final traits. It's a bit lackluster, and I believe this will come in very handy during moments where pulsing AoE damage is happening to your group while you are being stacked up. But, as I mentioned before, when compared to the other Soulbind traits, it's not as good. Bonesmith Heimer, oh geez, has been a consistent Soulbind used across all PvP and PvE content for Elemental and Restoration Shaman. The new patch brings Carver's Eye and Waking Bone Breastplate. Mastery is not our best stat by any means, but free stats are free stats, so you will likely be using this trait as an Elemental Shaman. The max HP increase is fine, but feels more like a tanking trait as a Shaman, and not really used in melee, so you're not really getting the full benefits of it. But it could be used by Enhancement Shaman since they are in melee. Though, why would you be an Enhancement Shaman and be Necrolord? Mnemonic Equipment offers a consistent execute damage bonus, which is a really nice addition to see for Necrolords, especially since you can give allies a damage bonus just by using a healing cooldown such as Ancestral Guidance or simply casting the Healing Surge on them, so it's quite good. Quite a cool trait to bring into progression rating. Though, keep in mind that this trait is weaker than Kevin's Oozling percentage damage-wise, so the final traits, when compared to each other, are not that good, but the overall Covenants Soulbinds themselves are more comparable. Overall, I think Necrolords will continue to be most versatile Covenant for the Elemental Shaman, and I myself started the season as a Necrolord for the PvP, arenas, and all that stuff, and progression rating. The new legendary effect, Splintered Elements, is another example of the Covenant Legendary being more of a support type effect than a standalone legendary effect. The haste buff isn't great enough to think of it otherwise, and the setup to get noticeable results is a bit of a pain. So, perhaps it would be a much more considerable option if the duration of the haste buff was much longer. Who knows what the future will hold. Your primary potency conduit is going to be Call of Flame, followed up with Shake the Foundations as your second potency slot. A lot of the time, you can actually put in a third potency slot depending on which Soulbind you're going to be using, in which case, consider using Essential Extraction or High Voltage depending on if it is a Tyrannical Weak or Fortified. And you can also use Tumbling Waves if you are a Necrolord Covenant. Your Endurance conduits are mainly going to comprise of Vital Accretion, Refreshing Waters, and Condensed Animosphere. Any of your Finesse conduits you mainly want to keep Thunderous Paws as it offers a really great boost in mobility for a short duration of time. And if you have multiple Finesse slot conduits, you can actually put in Spiritual Resonance as another option, granting you Spirit Walker's Grace while you are under the Bloodless effect for a limited amount of time. One of the biggest damage increases in dungeons going from mob pack to pack is going to be pooling your Maelstrom resources in anticipation for the next pull. I see so often this not being practiced by others, and it really does make a huge difference. So let's say if the current mobs are 20% HP or lower, consider how long you have left until combat drops. This will help you decide whether or not you need to start saving your Maelstrom or generating as much of it as you can for the next pull. That way, you start off with an Earthquake right away, or an Earthshock, depending on the legendary you're using, and you are already rolling in that damage. A common practice for top shamans would have been pooling Maelstrom before the start of the key, using a turnip punching bag, or pulling mobs in the dungeon before you put the key in. Resources, unfortunately, now reset at the start of the dungeon, though you can keep your Maelstrom if you exit the dungeon and come back in once the key starts. Another big mistake I see players make when it comes to Mythic Plus. A lot of players will not change their rotation on the fly to match the number of mobs they are facing. So quite often you will find yourself fighting a pack of 5 or 6 enemies, then suddenly in the middle of the pull 2 of the mobs have died and you are still just casting Chain Lightning and Earthquakes. You need to be able to read the situation before it's going to happen. Familiarize yourself with the HP values of mobs in dungeons, and start to change your rotation mid-pull when you notice that some of the mobs are going to be dying off soon. So, do this by prepping Flame Shocks on higher health mob units that will live longer. That way, once the low health mobs have died, you are now in a 3-target scenario, and you are already getting Lava Surge procs and can continue doing your most optimal damage rotation for that amount of targets. Keep in mind that in patch 9.05, it is now a DPS increase to cast Chain Lightning on 2 targets instead of 3 in the previous patches. This continues in 9.1. This will be the longest chapter of the video, so I'm going to split it up into 3 parts. The first part, we will cover the use of Echoes of Great Sundering Legendary. The second will cover the use of Skybreakers, and the third will cover the use of Seeds of Rampant Growth. I'm going to tell you now how you can open up on enemies in an AoE scenario. There are so many different ways to do your opener based on the legendary you are using, the maelstrom you have going into the pull, and the talents you are running. I have prepared several opening sequences that yield strong burst windows for you depending on which covenant you have chosen. The goal, like I mentioned in the previous cooldown usage chapter, is to get the biggest bang for your buck within your cooldowns. If you are part of the Night Fae Covenant, your openers are the same except for the Primordial Wave and Lava Burst integrations. You need to also keep in mind the duration of the First Strike crit buff when using the Karain Soulbind. The biggest priority you want to focus on is buffing your Empowered Earthquakes from the Legendary with Master of the Elements if you're using the talent. So spreading enough Flame Shock dots throughout the combat scenario to get Lava Surge procs is important. If you are using Storm Elemental instead, you do not need to maintain Flame Shocks and use Lava Bursts to empower your Earthquakes. In a perfect scenario, you want to have enough Maelstrom to either Earthquake or Earthshock, depending on if you have the legendary buff up already, right away to get going. If you do not have enough Maelstrom approaching the pull, you'll want to generate Maelstrom as quickly as possible with Chain Lightning. Use Stormkeeper right away in your opener if you have little to no Maelstrom available. Stormkeeper is your main Maelstrom generator in your opener and is a DPS increase to empower the Chain Lightning cast by Master of the Elements as well. But be careful not to prioritize Stormkeeper over your empowered Earthquakes. It is better to hold Lava Surge procs for the big Earthquakes than it is to use on the SK Chain Lightning. However, if your next Maelstrom dump cast is an Earthshock, consider empowering the Stormkeeper Chain Lightning instead. Primordial Wave is a unique ability to squeeze into your rotation within an AoE scenario. It should be used to spread additional Flame Shock dots, but also to generate large amounts of Maelstrom if used correctly. Ideally, you want to consume the Primordial Wave buff while you have 3 or more Flame Shock dots active out to generate enough Maelstrom, or to generate at least 40 Maelstrom from the additional Lava Burst cast it provides. You should also consider using the buff at the most opportunistic moment, as you will be provided a Master of the Elements buff following the Lava Burst cast used. Consuming the Primordial Wave buff to generate enough Maelstrom before your Empowered Earthquake cast is the preferred way to use the spell. Your Fire Elemental is a cooldown that can be used liberally and pretty much on CD. It does not impact your AoE DPS very much, but can be used in conjunction with Primordial Wave to yield large Lava Burst cleave due to the increased duration of Flame Shock while the Elemental is active. If you are using Storm Elemental, it will provide a big DPS increase to your AoE damage with proper use of Eye of the Storm. It is important to wait until your Storm Elemental has used Call Lightning before casting Eye of the Storm, as the buff it provides is very significant. Your single target spell priority rotation has not changed with the legendary. Use your generator spells to build Maelstrom and your spender spells to dump it. You want to buff your Earthshocks, Earthquakes, and Stormkeeper empowered lightning bolts with Master of the Elements and refrain from overcapping your Maelstrom. Having explained the ideal situations, as well as how the spells interact with each other, we now can hop into what your opener will play out like. A spell cast tracker can be seen on the screen to better showcase the spell queue. I will also be explaining the rotation based on the ideal situations of having at least 90 Maelstrom to be able to Earthshock right away. If you need more information about the rotation variances based on how much Maelstrom you have going into the pull, I suggest joining my Discord community where the opening sequence are displayed in the Barako Guide channel. At the start of the pull, you want to precast your Fire Elemental and start by applying Flame Shock to the higher health target. We are now buying time for Flame Shock to come off cooldown, so your next spell cast will depend on your Maelstrom amounts and cooldown available. Now you will cast Earth Shock and cast Chain Lightning into a Lava Burst. Now use Stormkeeper into your second Flame Shock. Now you will Earth Shock and cast Chain Lightning into a Lava Burst. And use Stormkeeper into your second Flame Shock on the second target. Primordial Wave the third target, and use your Racials on Use Trinkets at this moment. Cast your first Earthquake into a Chain Lightning, then Earth Shock. Cast Lava Burst, then use your second Earthquake. Follow this up with a Chain Lightning cast and an Earth Shock, and continue with your spell priority rotation. This opening sequence plays into empowering your first Earthquake as early as possible and ensuring your Stormkeeper burst window has the biggest stat increase possible from Soulbind abilities as well as any buffs you have put on yourself. The opener will be slightly different depending on how much Maelstrom you have going into the pull. Your opening rotation will also need to be adjusted based off of the amount of procs from Aftershock or the Tumbling Wave Covenant Conduit if you are Necrolord. There are times where you can just get an absurd amount of resets where things become daunting. Just practice often so that you can optimally to reverse these moments. The Skybreakers build revolves around spreading and maintaining your Flame Shock dot on as many targets as possible based on how often you need your Fire or Storm Elemental cooldown back. The Fire Elemental build can maintain more Flame Shock dots and yield higher sustained damage with the use of Master of the Elements to empower your Earthquakes and priority target spells. The Storm Elemental build yields higher upfront burst damage, which can be more beneficial in a kite-heavy tank meta and depending on which affixes you have for the week, though it is arguably harder to play due to the requiring and more micromanagement playstyle. For Fire Elemental, your Earthquake spell still takes priority of Master of the Elements with this build and should be buffed as often as possible when using the talent. You can also get much more value out of Primordial Wave due to the higher number of Flame Shock dots being able to be active at once while your Elemental is out. Hard casting Lava Burst in AoE is not advised unless you're consuming a Primordial Wave buff to send out multiple Lava Bursts. Your main Maelstrom generation will still come from your Stormkeeper talent in AoE, but outside of Stormkeeper, your building and spending of Maelstrom is very straightforward. Build Maelstrom with Chain Lightning and spend it on Earthquakes in AoE combat. Your single target spell priority rotation has not changed with this legendary. You want to buff your Earthshocks and Stormkeeper empowered Lightning Bolts with Master of the Elements and refrain from overcapping your Maelstrom. Start your opener by pre-casting Stormkeeper and Fire Elemental. If you have enough Maelstrom to Earthquake, you should hardcast Lava Burst into a Flame Shock on your first target. Drop your first Earthquake and build Maelstrom up again with Chain Lightning and cast Flame Shock on your second target. If you had no Maelstrom going into this pull, this is where your opener would start. You can also use Primordial Wave on your third target and cast an additional Flame Shock into your fourth target. You would be okay to hardcast Lava Burst here to consume the Primordial Wave buff. You will generate enough Maelstrom to Earthquake again here, as well as having it buffed by Master of the Elements. Continue to do your sustained AoE, priority spell rotation, and spread additional Flame Shock dots in reaction to Tumbling Wave procs if you are using the Conduit. Like the Echoes of Great Sundering opener, this one plays into empowering your Earthquakes as often as possible, but also allows you to have more of them active since all of your resources are going into Earthquakes instead of being split with Earthshock. The opener for Storm Elemental is a bit more fast-paced and hectic as you need to be keeping track of various buffs and timers to make the most of it. This includes your Storm Elemental's special ability, Eye of the Storm, which is the main damaging ability of the Elemental. Earlier, we also talked about stacking your cooldowns and buffs to get the most out of them, and this also plays into the Skybreakers Storm Elemental build heavily. If you are in the Night Fae Covenant, having the First Strike crit buff up for your Stormkeeper Earthquake spam, Eye of the Storm, and using an on-use trinket like the PvP badge or Soul Letting Ruby all at the same time yields massive amounts of AoE burst damage. When timing your Storm Elemental, it is important to understand the route of the dungeon and whether or not you need Storm Elemental to be available for the next pull. Ask yourself, can I use it here? Will spreading and maintaining Flame Shock dots during the Storm Elemental window bring it back up in time for the next pull you need it on? Answering this question will come with practice and experience, but this is mainly why it is not recommended to play Skybreaker's Storm Elemental unless you are in an organized group. Assuming you have enough Maelstrom to drop an Earthquake right away, you will start the pull with pre-casting Stormkeeper. Summon your Storm Elemental and spam Earthquakes and Chain Lightnings. Wait for your Storm Elemental to empower itself with its Call Lightning ability before you have it cast Eye of the Storm, or you will waste its damage potential. Call Lightning will always be your Storm Elemental's highest priority spell if the buff it provides is not on the Elemental currently. If you need the Elemental for the next pull, spread and maintain Flame Shock dots and utilize Primordial Wave to do so. Consume the Primordial Wave buff at 4 Flame Shock targets. There will be a short window to do so. If you do not need the Storm Elemental for the next pull, let your Flame Shock dots fall off and just spam Chain Lightning and Earthquakes. The rest of the pull is continuing your AoE rotation and just getting out as many Earthquakes as possible while adjusting to mob count and prepping for the next pull. There are some niche things, some situational things, some nuances, some really good tips that I want to give you guys when it comes to certain things that Elemental Shaman have interactions with. Namely, we're going to talk about Storm Elemental here, when I should just be casting Lightning Bolt, when I should be integrating Lava Burst into my damage rotation, should I be refreshing Flame Shock? So this is the kind of thing that I want to cover here. So if you are in a single target situation and you're using Storm Elemental, while Storm Elemental is active and you have Bloodlust active, meaning your haste is much more significant, you want to refresh Flame Shock only as a movement speed, like an instant cast global. So if you need to cast something while you're moving, that's when you would cast Flame Shock. And while your Flame Shock is active, obviously you could be getting some Lava Surge procs here, so only use those Lava Surge procs if you need to move as well. Your basic rotation otherwise would just be spam casting Lightning Bolts and using your Maelstrom on Earthshock or Earthquake if you're running Echoes of the Great Sundering. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. If you are not benefiting from the Bloodlust haste value, but you still are running Storm Elemental, you can maintain your Flame Shock on here and only use Lava Burst during Lava Surge procs. Other than that, spam Lightning Bolt and use your Maelstrom on your Maelstrom Spenders, aka Earthshock and Earthquake, if you're running a Legendary. For 2 targets, since 9.05 did have some balancing changes, Chain Lightning is now a DPS increase, as I mentioned before, on 2 targets. So you definitely want to be spamming Chain Lightning instead of Lightning Bolt if you have Storm Elemental out in a 2-target scenario. Of course, Stormkeeper should, on a 2-target scenario, should still be used on Lightning Bolts as it yields higher damage throughput in those situations. You obviously want to be spending your Maelstrom on Earthshocks and Earthquakes here if you're running the Echoes of the Great Sundering Legendary, and you can use your Flame Shock. If you're Necrolord, you would use Primordial Wave as well, and you would use your Lava Burst, Lava Surge procs for movement globals only. When playing with the Seeds of Rampant Growth Legendary, your opener in AoE combat is actually really simple and straightforward. The goal is to get the full value out of both the cooldown reduction and crit buff the Legendary provides. So your Storm Elemental should already be out before you start to cast Fey Transfusion. It is also recommended that you do not desync Storm Elemental and Fey Transfusion, meaning that while playing this Legendary, these 2 abilities should be used together. This Legendary also gives us more opportunities to do the spam Lightning Bolt play for single target in Tyrannical Keys if you are running the Dreamweaver Soulbind. Spamming Lightning Bolt while your Storm Elemental is out is a DPS increase while standing in Fields Blossoms to take advantage of the haste buff. if you do not have this additional haste while Storm Elemental is out, it may not be worth just spamming casting Lightning Bolts, so you should throw in some additional Lava Burst in there. Start out by pre-casting Stormkeeper and summon your Storm Elemental. Then use any unused trinkets and combat potions. Channel Fey Transfusion into your targets until you have reached its end, and make sure to use your Elemental's Eye of the Storm ability at the most opportunistic moment. Then use your Stormkeeper stacks on either Chain Lightning or a Lightning Bolt, depending on if it is single target or an AoE scenario, obviously. Then just put out as many Earthquakes as possible in AoE and Earth Shocks in single target scenarios. I get a lot of questions as well when it comes to the use of Ice Fury, mainly in a raid environment. I know this is generally a Mythic Plus kind of video, but I wanted to dabble a little bit into Ice Fury and its nuances and how you can properly play it, because I've talked about rotational nuances already. Now, Ice Fury is a very difficult ability to weave into your rotation, especially now with Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence taking up a lot of your globals in a single target scenario, that is. So I want to give you a little bit of tips in order to better understand proper use of Ice Fury. Things that I want you to understand to avoid would be obviously not overcapping your Maelstrom. That's a no-no, okay? Try to stagger or separate the use of your Stormkeeper and Ice Fury, so that way the buffs of them are not active at the same time, and you're not fighting to get all of these instant cast spells out. So if Ice Fury and Stormkeeper come up at the same time, prioritize Stormkeeper over Ice Fury, and once Stormkeeper is used, then you can start to use your Ice Fury and use that. Do not try and buff every single Ice Fury Frost Shock charge with Master of the Elements. This does not need to happen. A lot of people will overthink this and try and buff every single one of their Ice Fury stacks, and then they end up not getting all of their Ice Furies out because of this. Just don't overthink it. If you have Ice Fury stacks, it should mainly just replace Lightning Bolt as filler spells in Maelstrom generations. Now, here's a thing that not a lot of people will think about when it comes to Ice Fury, and this is the duration of your buff. How long do you have left on your buff? If you have a higher duration of the buff left, certain spells become higher priority, namely Elemental Blast, Earth Shock, right, Lava Burst, all that stuff. Those spells take priority over your Frost Shock spells. If you have a higher duration of the buff remaining. But as the duration of the buff lowers, so do the other spells' priorities in your rotation. Mainly because you don't want the buff to fall off before you've spent these stacks of buffed Frost Shock. So when you have a low duration left on your Frost Shock, they become higher priority. Keep that in mind. It is okay to just cast 2-3 Frost Shocks back to back when you have low duration left on your Ice Fury buff. So keep these things in mind when you do play the Ice Fury talent. I go over these mainly in my coaching sessions. Little shout out to that. If you guys are interested in coaching, definitely hit up the coaching frequently asked questions in my Discord channel. Link in the description down below. But I hope this was helpful for that, and we'll move on from here. Now I want to talk about the new seasonal affix and various other videos. We're going to be having a section dedicated specifically to the seasonal affix. So with this one, we're going to be talking about anima powers for Shadowlands Season 2 Mythic Plus. Sagond's the Breaker. Usually you're going to want to go with the Stone Ward as your anima power. Tiny Dancing Shoes, you're not really going to take effect because you're not melee, so there's no reason for you to have to dodge 2 melee or ranged attacks, right? And Dripping Fang, like, you can get leech from other sources. So the Stone Ward is going to be the most impactful, as it is a very large shield. You're going to see a quite substantial amount from this over the course of the entire dungeon. Incinerator Arcalath, the default choice here is just going to be Champion's Brand, as additional crit is just super useful for Elemental Shaman, but you could make a case for Signet of Bolstering, specifically when certain affixes are actually in the rotation. So you get stacks of Bolstering from explosive orbs being killed, not detonating, but being killed by your teammates, and also spiteful mobs being killed. So you can actually cheese the crap out of additional percentage damage on those type of weeks, which it's quite useful. But other than that, Champion's Brand is just the default. For Roast Coldheart, I tend to run with Regenerative Fungus unless you are in a dungeon where there is a lot of interrupts happening, such as Theater of Pain. You can make a case for Mist of Tyrna Scythe, right? Last boss has a lot of interrupts, so you could definitely take advantage of the increased 10% damage for 8 seconds when you interrupt the boss. Same thing for the first boss, Ingra, in Mist of Tyrna Scythe. A lot of mobs in the Theater of Pain have to be interrupted, so that could come in handy there. You know, you can make a case for it also in Halls of Atonement as well, because you have the Obliterator mobs that do a lot of interrupting there. Of course, if kicks are assigned, that makes it very useful. So in a situation or in a group where you are organized, Handbook is very good. For just pugging keys, I would actually recommend just using Regenerative Fungus. And even in organized group, Regenerative Fungus is really good in Plaguefall, so keep that in mind as well. Executioner Varuth. The DPS choice here, like the default choice, I would say, is also Champion's Brand. You make a lot of use of this additional crit rating, but again, you could make a case for either Dagger of Necrotic Wounding or Volcanic Plumage. Volcanic Plumage is barely ever used as an Elemental Shaman. You already get a lot of natural interrupts and CCs from your Earthquakes, and Volcanic Plumage does not add a substantial amount of damage or noticeable damage to your kit. It doesn't really proc that much as an Elemental Shaman. You tend to see it proc more for melee classes such as Fury Warriors, Rogues, right? Rep Paladins. This procs a lot more for melee, but it doesn't for ranged classes. If it did proc a lot more, I would tend to make better case for it, but it doesn't, so we're going to move over to Necrotic Wounding. This is exceptionally powerful on Tyrannical weeks. It can be 7, 8, sometimes 10% of your damage to bosses, and it has quite a high uptime, so it's very good for Tyrannical weeks. Definitely run this when you're pushing those higher keys on the Tyrannical affixes. But other than that, just run Champion's Brand. So obviously this video is a little bit more of the nitty-gritty stuff, the nuances of Elemental Shaman, and a lot of tips and tricks and additional information. It's not really some of the basics when it comes to learning the class. But we do have additional resources for that kind of stuff as a community. Go and check out Wowhead. Go and check out Icy Veins. There's also Stormkeeper, which is a European website. I'll leave all the links to the Elemental Shaman guides to those websites, along with other additional useful information that I think you guys should have access to and know about in the video's description down below. So go and check that stuff out. So this concludes the patch 9.1 Elemental Shaman Mythic Plus guide. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, please consider also supporting my content that I create with my editors by visiting my Patreon page. Also check out my Twitch livestream where I stream and do competitive Mythic Plus content along with other fun activities. You can come and hang out, ask questions, whatever you'd like. Check out also my social media pages. All the links to everything will be in the description of the video down below. I hope that this video was helpful to you guys watching, and if you learned something new from it, then fantastic. Please comment down below what you guys think, and I will try my best to answer all the comments. Like the video if you like it, subscribe for more Shadowlands content in the future, and remember, keep calm and Maelstrom on. Bye-bye.